Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Nicola. Before I begin, I would just first like to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on traditional unceded Mohawk territory, and I would like to pay my formal respects to the Mohawk peoples, and I stand in solidarity with them. So, originally valued as neutral scientific documents, maps have traditionally been studied for the insight they could provide on the transformation and definition of national borders over time. In recent scholarship, maps have come to be understood as constructions, powerful tools used to legitimate colonial power over a particular place. This is especially true of cartographic documents of the New World, through which European imperial powers were attempting to understand and classify and ultimately dominate a previously unknown continent. Although representative of a colonial perspective of the New World, maps also contain evidence of the interrelationships of the encounter between Native peoples and Europeans. These documents can be considered in terms of what Mary Louise Pratt calls contact zones. And as such, maps, which have long been of interest in the academic world, remain important documents to study. It is essential that we continue to work on them from a post-colonial point of view in the hopes of decolonizing the historical grand narratives that they have for centuries reinforced. In doing so, we may begin to reconstruct an image of the New World during the early years of contact to include multiple narratives, not simply the one-sided account of the colonizer. My research uses a framework called Cartographic Contextualization, so to provide as much context for the creation, dissemination, and use of the map as possible. This entails the application of post-colonial critique in looking at these maps as constructions, as well as the application of decolonizing methodologies through the incorporation of alternative sources of information, and in this case, Native oral histories and worldviews. The goal being to deconstruct the maps in question, to break down and understand the elements within their borders, and to critique the visual elements. So focusing on a series that has come to be known as the Beaver Maps, my research has revealed a total of 15 maps, each containing the Beaver cartouche, which is a very specific image depicting a group of industrious beavers building a dam at Niagara Falls, produced in France, England, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands between 1698 and 1794. While the scene of beavers building a dam might seem like a fairly normal choice of imagery to accompany maps of the New World, this scene is far from normal. The entire image is rather unusual, with muscular, lion-like beavers walking around on their hind legs, carrying lumber over their shoulder, or even dragging rocks on their tails. Even more unusual are the various roles they seem to occupy, each focusing on a specific task, as described in the accompanying vignette legend, which you can see right down here. Captured most successfully in this image is the perceived industrious nature of the beaver in New France, suggesting an organized group of animals with a distinct social hierarchy and rigorous work ethics. A common interpretation of the beaver cartouche is its threefold representation of the success of the fur trade, the erasure of native peoples, and as a symbol for hardworking Europeans taming a wild land. I aim to challenge and complexify this reading. Within my thesis, I will argue that the dual nature of the beaver as both a natural curiosity, so its frequent appearance in myths and texts dating from ancient times through to the early modern period, and status as a lucrative resource is what initially spurred its continued appearance in cartographic documents of the New World. However, through the application of post-colonial theory and decolonizing methodologies, I will also argue that the beaver cartouche serves as a point of entry into the active role played by Native American nations in the fur trade, the encounter between European and Native peoples, as well as the rich oral histories and worldviews of the Mi'kmaq Nation. It is this aspect, that of the encounter, that I will focus on today. So I don't have time to show you or to talk about all of the maps, but I would like to just quickly go through some slides to give you a sense of the extent to which this image was widely circulated in Europe. So the first map to include the beaver cartouche was produced in 1698 by Nicolas de Fer, who, along with his successors, reused this image several times. So you can see the cartouches right up here in the corner. And the second map appears in 1705 again, cartouche is right here. He uses it again, almost in the same format, in 1713. The cartouche again is up in this corner here. And then in another map from 1713, which is slightly different from the original, but also uses the cartouche right up here. And then printed after his death by his successors, a return to the original format. Cartouche is right up here. And then again in 1739, also the same format right up here. And the beaver cartouche was also appropriated by 4 other cartographers. The first being an Italian cartographer named Paolo Petrini, whose map first appears in 1700 and was later reissued in 1718. And you can see the cartouche is right up here in the corner. Essentially, it's an exact copy of Defar's original map, just written in Italian. Then we have Johann Baptist Homan, whose map appears in 1707. You can see the beaver cartouche is right here. Then we have probably the most recognized beaver map by the British cartographer Herman Moore, which appears in 1715 and was reissued in 1732. Obviously, the cartouche is right here. Then we have the Dutch Henri Abraham Châtelain, whose map is essentially an exact copy of Defar's 1713 map. You can see the beaver cartouche is right up here. And then finally, another British map by map producers Laurie and Whittle, who have stolen cartouches from several different maps. You can see the beaver cartouche is right up here. And so we can see that between 1698 and 1794, the image was very widely circulated. Elements in the beaver cartouche are lettered and correspond to a legend that provides a description of what is being visually represented. The legend reads as follows. We first have the lumberjacks, so they're right up here. Then we have the carpenters down here, B, and C, the, what do we call them? Those who transport lumber. Then we have, over here in this corner, D, those who make mortar. E right here, so this is the commander or architect. You can see he's got his paw raised up as if he's giving some sort of order. Then down here, F, this is the inspector of the invalids. Over here, G, those who carry mortar with their tails. And then this guy over here, this is my favorite beaver, H, the lazy or injured beaver, having injured his tail from working too hard. And then finally over here we have the masons. You can see one right here. And L, these are the beavers that use their tail to solidify the masonry. And then in the distance we have a little, just one little beaver lodge for all those beavers. So a significant part of understanding this image is to situate it within a very long tradition of various myths and descriptions of beavers in ancient texts, medieval bestiaries, early modern travel texts and ethnographies, as well as data belief systems and creation stories. There have been descriptions of beavers and mentions of the uses of castoreum within natural history treatises dating back to Pliny. In medieval times, these descriptions talk of a self-castrating beaver, valued for its castoreum, which is a secretion produced by scent glands in the beaver prized for its medicinal and olfactory properties. It was believed that if pursued, a beaver would know the reason for which it was being chased, and would thus castrate itself and throw the castoreum gland in the direction of the hunter, as a means of self-preservation. If the beaver had already lost this valuable gland, it would stand up on its hind legs to show the hunter that it was no longer in possession of what he sought. And it's important to note that although humorous to us, these accounts would have been taken seriously, and a certain virtue was attributed to the beaver, especially in Catholic texts, where the beaver is seen as a symbol of generosity. So accounts of the beaver in the New World go through 2 significant changes. First, there is a turn away from castoreum to physical descriptions, possibly as a result of the growing interest in pelts. Second, there is a shift from physical to social descriptions. These changes likely arise from a European desire to classify and understand the New World. For example, early explorers were uncertain as to whether the beaver should be classified as a fish or a mammal. As we see here in Le Livre des Simples Médecines from 1480, where a beaver has a fish body and tail instead of his own actual tail. So of particular value in terms of trying to decipher this shift towards the perceived social organization is Nicolas Denis' Description géographique from 1672. This text seems to have inspired the original beaver inset found on Defar's 1698 map, and is the first text in which descriptions of the beaver shift from anatomical to social. Most chapters focus on marine life, but one chapter in particular goes into great detail about the Castor. Denis' text specifically mentions the various roles held by different members of a beaver community, their industrious nature, dexterity, hierarchical society, and ability to communicate. He notes that they are even more intelligent than monkeys and should be considered of the highest rank in the animal kingdom. Much of this description and some of the exact language used can be read in the legend on Defar's map. The fact that descriptions of the beaver within travel texts from the colonial period went through two significant shifts, from Castorium to physical and then from physical to social, is irrefutable, although it remains unclear why such descriptions went through their second shift, or why Denis chose to describe them as such. And it is here where decolonizing methodologies become invaluable to the deconstruction of the beaver cartouche. Linda Tahiwai-Smith's indigenizing project, as proposed in her groundbreaking text, Decolonizing Methodologies, calls for a, quote, centering in consciousness of the landscapes, images, languages, themes, metaphors, and stories of the indigenous world, and the disconnecting of many of the cultural ties between the settler society and its metropolitan homeland, end quote. Through the lens of this indigenizing project, the beaver cartouche and the text which inspired its creation can be approached from a different angle. The legacy of native stories surrounding the beaver that existed in parallel to the various descriptions and legends that were taking shape among European settlers. Acadia, as it was then known, is a significant location in understanding the Beaver Maps. It was an area highly sought after by both French and British empires, and falls within the territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Mi'kmaq First Nation occupied the area of Acadia in question, being Nova Scotia, though their territory extends far beyond that region. With trade relationships going back decades, the Mi'kmaq allied themselves with the French to fight the British. It is not to say that this was an entirely peaceful or unproblematic relationship, but it was born out of a mutual need to survive against incoming British troops. At the time, Denis was the governor of Acadia. He lived through the early French settlement of the area and published his Description géographique roughly 20 years into the Acadian-Mi'kmaq alliance. He dedicated several chapters of the Description géographique to his understanding of Mi'kmaq traditions. One passage in particular addresses their storytelling traditions and makes specific reference to the stories told about animals, notably stories told about beavers. What this suggests is that Denis was well aware of the traditions of storytelling among the Mi'kmaq, and quite probably was privy to hearing some of these stories firsthand. It seems safe to conclude that while his description of beaver societies and their industrious nature reflect a European worldview in terms of settling and developing the New World, the shift that occurred from anatomical to social within European descriptions of the beaver may well be inspired by Mi'kmaq stories. There are endless examples of these stories, most of which feature Glooskap, the creator or transformer. Common features of these stories are the manner in which beavers are used to explain the formation of various elements in the landscape, such as mountains, rivers, meadows, islands, and even the tides. Often the beavers are described as being very large, intelligent, and are gifted with the ability to communicate. Several stories also describe how Glooskap brought good to the world, as the beavers of old, aside from being very large, were also troublemakers, which may stem from the drastic and sometimes disastrous ways in which a beaver dam can alter a landscape in a very short period of time. One of the more common stories tells of beavers larger than bears wreaking havoc on the landscape by blocking rivers, destroying forests, flooding meadows, or even preventing the salmon from swimming upriver to spawn. The people called upon Glooskap to come to their aid. Glooskap then hunted down and fought these giant beavers. In many cases, mountains, islands, or other similar features are said to be the remains of giant beavers defeated by Glooskap. In several stories, it is explained that Glooskap, taking mercy on the remaining giant beavers, speaks to them and gently pets them until they have shrunk down to the size we see today, a size small enough that they could no longer cause significant damage. And so there are many similarities between Denis' social description of the beaver and Mi'kmaq accounts, notably the beaver's ability to communicate, their organization and industrious nature, as well as moralistic undertones. It is Denis' emphasis on the organization and cunning nature of the beaver that makes his account so unique from previous European accounts, and therefore the shift that I've suggested may indeed have been influenced by Mi'kmaq stories. So through the framework of cartographic contextualization and the application of post-colonial theory and decolonizing methodologies, my research aims to deconstruct all of the elements involved in the creation and perpetuation of the beaver cartouche. The cartouche is undoubtedly a projection of French interests in the New World based on resources such as fur, but also of an idyllic land supposedly ripe for the taking that could be tamed and shaped by hardworking settlers. However, through the application of decolonizing methodologies such as indigenizing and drawing a parallel between European descriptions and native oral histories, a more nuanced history begins to unfold, underscoring the interactions between the French and Mi'kmaq in Acadia. And so the Beaver Maps, though often seen through the lens of European colonialism, can also serve as a point of entry into the active role played by Native American nations in the fur trade, as well as oral histories, which is a very small step towards decolonizing the historical grand narrative so often told of the early years of French presence in the Americas.